Chapter 1. A Stagecoach in the Night. The year was 1865. President Lincoln had been assassinated, and the Civil War had ended in April. The war, which claimed the lives of over 620,000 soldiers on both sides, was over at last. On a dark and stormy night in the great north woods of New Hampshire, a stagecoach bound for Montreal battled its way along a road that the weather had turned into a sea of mud. The coach hit a pothole and overturned near the town of Whitefield. The driver directed the stranded passengers up a dirt track, telling them they would find shelter at a farmhouse about a half a mile away, home to Mr. and Mrs. William Dodge. The travelers were warmly welcomed by the Dodges, who offered them food and a place to sleep. The next morning, the guests were captivated by the breathtaking views of the Presidential Mountain Range, a glorious series of 4,000-foot peaks in the White Mountains. The crowning glory being Mount Washington, or Agikochuk, meaning home of the Great Spirit. Standing at 6,288 feet, making it the highest peak in the northeastern United States. Greatly impressed by the hospitality and incredible views, the travelers stayed a few more days with the family so that they could explore the area. Before continuing their journey to Montreal, the guest suggested the Dodges consider opening an inn. Mr. William Dodge was the second generation of his family to live in Whitefield. His parents, Mr. William Dodge Sr. and his wife Eunice Newell Dodge, moved to the area in 1823. They built the third house that was in town and opened Whitefield's first store. Mr. William Dodge Sr. was appointed as Whitefield's first postmaster when the mail facilities arrived around 1924, and he also held the positions of town clerk, town representative to the general court, and superintendent of schooling. Governor John Wentworth awarded a tract of land named Whitefields to Josiah Moody and 89 other petitioners on July 4, 1774, the eve of the American Revolution. This may have been the last township granted under the authority of King George III of England. Local historian Drew Merrill noted that Governor Wentworth was a royalist, and many of the townships that he granted were to petitioners who held commissions of the royal seal. The surrounding areas of Lancaster, Jefferson, Carroll, Bethlehem, and Dalton have already been established, and therefore the land granted to the Whitefield petitioners was essentially leftover land. The town was officially incorporated in 1804. It is unclear as to where the name Whitefields came from. One theory is that the area was named in remembrance of the Reverend George Whitefield, who was a famous Methodist preacher. He delivered sermons all over the East and has been called by some the most important religious figure of the 18th century. The Reverend, who had died 4 years earlier, had been a friend of Governor Wentworth. By the 1830s, Whitefield industries centered on lumber and wood products. Mills producing shingle and clapboard sprung up all along the banks of the Johns River that runs through the town. The Dodge family was also involved in this enterprise and owned a lumber mill. The remoteness of Whitefield was the industry's biggest problem. Whitefield had no railroad, which made transportation of mill products to the major cities a slow and hard process. Whitefield had a thriving agriculture community. In 1852, it was home to more sheep than people. With 1,250 sheep roaming the countryside, the town's 909 cows provided 2,000 pounds of cheese and 12 to 14 tons of butter per year. 5 years later, a mill making starch from potatoes had opened for business, with 2 others joining in by the end of the Civil War. William Dodge married a local girl, Mary Jane Eastman. The couple moved to a site recently cleared by Mary's father and built a simple log cabin. Despite the Civil War, the couple extended the cabin into a 4-room house and farm. It was this farmhouse which the stranded Montreal passengers visited. Chapter 2. Mountain View House. The Dodges saw a grand opportunity in the traveler's advice and added a 16-room extension complete with a full veranda to the farmhouse. The first incarnation of today's hotel was born as Mountain View House. The Dodgers placed a small advertisement in the Boston Transcript, and in 1866 received their first registered guest. By 1852, a side track of the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad had reached the nearby town of Littleton. Mr. Dodge would travel 13 miles by horse and cart to pick up his guests from the station and would bring them back to the inn. As the railroad drew nearer to Whitefield, investors became intrigued by the financial possibilities of the area's vast timber reserves. A businessman from Maine, Mr. R.B. Dunn, purchased many of the older mills before merging with other companies to form the White Mountain Lumber Company. Dunn built the largest and most technologically advanced mill complex in the region, using steam engines to power machinery. Tragically, the lower part of the mill was lost in a fire in 1856. Natural disasters such as flooding and fires were often the end of businesses in the area. In 1868, Olson and W.G. Brown formed a partnership called Brown Company. They purchased huge tracts of forested land and the charred remains of Mr. Dunn's lower mills, which they reopened with one steam-powered saw. The Browns knew that even with steam technology, they needed the railroad to reach Whitefield for their business to flourish. Within their first year of opening, the Browns convinced the White Mountain Railroad Company to send a line of railroad to the Whitefield mills via the town of Bethlehem. The Browns' proposition was probably aided by their gift to the railroad company of $4,000, the equivalent of $900,000 today. Local historian Kim Nielsen described the arrival of the railroad to Whitefield as a booster shot for the town. It no longer took months to export goods to cities such as New York, Boston, and Portland. Business now could be conducted in a matter of days. The railroad also opened up opportunities for the tourist industry. On October 5, 1870, the first passenger train arrived in Whitefield, bringing travelers all the way from Boston. For the Dodgers, this meant more business, and in 1872 they tore down the original farmhouse and replaced it with a 3-story building with a small tower in the Gothic style that was popular at the time. The lobby is part of this extension and the oldest part of today's hotel. 7 years later, the Dodgers extended again, adding an entirely new west wing. For each extension, the Dodgers took out a mortgage, but the popularity of Mountain View House meant it was promptly paid off. Every time the Dodgers managed to pay back their mortgage in full, they would burn the documents in celebration. By 1885, Alexander Graham Bell had patented the telephone. Thomas Edison had invented the incandescent light, and the Browns had the largest mill operation in New England. They had expanded their product line to include gutters, hardwood floors, moldings, and masts for sailing ships. Lumber workers' annual wage was $550, somewhere between $14,000 and $16,000 today. Many of the workers were French Canadians who crossed the border to find work. Often assigned to the harder jobs out in the woods, they made up about half of the town's population. In 1875, Whitefield's signature bandstand was erected. Whitefield's amateur band often provided audiences with promenade concerts and strawberry suppers. The band insisted, however, on fining people 25 cents, about $5 by today's standards, for any disturbances. Chapter 3, Van Dodge. In 1884, Van Herbert Dodge, William and Mary's son, took the reins from his father and became the second generation to run the inn. 4 years later, he married Alice Stebbins, the principal of a local private school. Under Alice's daily supervision and Van's counsel and bookkeeping skills, the small inn expanded to a popular resort hotel. By 1888, the hotel was capable of holding 100 guests. Before he moved to the West Coast, Van's brother Charles planted a long line of maple trees that stood for years out in front of the hotel until 1999. Many of the first resort hotels were built for health reasons. In Europe, visits to towns such as Bath in England that had mineral springs were popular. It was believed that drinking and bathing in the mineral water was beneficial and could cure a number of ailments. Wealthy Americans continued the trend, visiting places such as Newton Springs outside of Boston. Urban entrepreneurs started building lodgings for these visitors at the turn of the 19th century, and the first resort hotels were born. Although originally built in destination health spots, the development of inns into resort hotels, because of their scenic location, quickly became popular. Cultural movements such as Romanticism encouraged people's appreciation for nature and influenced the building of resort hotels and inns in areas such as New Hampshire's White Mountains. By the mid-1800s, the wealthy were establishing their identity through travel, and many would partake in the grand tour of the Northeast by staying at resort hotels referred to as grand old ladies. By necessity, resorts catered fully to guests, providing lodging, food, recreation, and entertainment. Events such as balls, lectures, hikes, and recitals allowed for a mingling of young men and women, and resorts became widely recognized as places where parents could find eligible partners for their children. Unlike urban hotels where guests may only stay for days at a time, patrons of resort hotels would stay for weeks or months. Mountain View House was only open for the summer season, and often the same clientele returned each year. Guests would receive personal letters from the Dodgers before the season started, inquiring to their health and would they be staying that summer, and if so, would they like their usual room. The Industrial Revolution swept the country following the end of the Civil War. Increasing accessibility by railroads was a key factor in the success of resort hotels such as Mountain View House that flourished in the White Mountains in the late 1800s and early 1900s. By the 1890s, the Maine Central Railroad and the Concord and Montreal Railroad had lines passing through the town. Every day, 6 trains from Boston and 2 from New York brought passengers up to the White Mountains. The Boston and Maine Railroad also ran a line through town. Each railroad company had their own station in Whitefield, and 2 of them are still standing today. One is now the American Legion building, and Dunkin' Donuts now occupies the Boston and Maine station. The proximity of the White Mountains to major East Coast cities made the trip by rail a comfortable adventure for the cream of society traveling in luxurious passenger cars pulled by powerful locomotives through the wilderness to their summer lodgings. When the guests arrived in Whitefield, they not only found a busy timber industry, but also a thriving retail community. Downtown clothing stores, apothecaries, and dry goods merchants proudly displayed their wares in the shop windows. By 1900, there was a greater concentration of resort hotels in the White Mountains than anywhere else in the nation. At any given time, more than 12,000 people could be accommodated in the area's many resorts, inns, and boarding houses. The regular trains meant even more guests, and in 1892, the Dodgers extended the West Wing. In 1897, the first golf magazine hit American newsstands, and the public demand for it soared. The hotel opened a small golf course in 1900. On July 20th, 1889, Barnum and Bailey Circus, the greatest show on earth, came to town. The circus set up their tents on the fields of the Chase family farm. The whole menagerie, including elephants and zebras, arrived by train. Just like the lumber boom, the agriculture community in Whitefield rocketed. One of the largest farms belonged to Lewis Hazen, which stretched over 6,000 acres, located where Whitefield Airport is today. Lewis Hazen was a keen breeder of racehorses, and the farm housed a racetrack often visited by guests from the Mountain View House. The farm also hosted the first Coos County and Grafton County Fair, complete with exhibition halls. Under Van and Alice's supervision, many of the conveniences that we take for granted today were installed, including steam heating, electricity, and indoor plumbing. In 1906, the original 16-room extension was removed and the new East Wing built, ending at the present-day Dodge Parlor. In 1911, the third floor was added, and the tower, conceived in the late Italian Revival style, was raised to its now signature 89 feet 8 inches. Even as the hotel grew from its status as a country inn to a destination resort, Mountain View House was still a working farm. It had been extended by 500 acres and contained stables capable of housing 20 horses. The farm was a vital factor in supplying milk, chickens, eggs, pork, fresh fruit, and vegetables to the hotel's kitchens. Sam Tan was in charge of running the farm and made sure the livestock were a priority by enforcing the rule that no golf was to be played on the back 3 holes of the course until all the hay had been gathered in. Chapter 4. Frank Dodge. World War I, or the Great War as it was named at the time, had been raging in Europe since 1914, and on April 6, 1917, the United States joined the fight. 85 of the 88 men from Whitefield who went to fight returned home when the war finished in 1918. In 1920, Frank Skyler Dodge followed in the family footsteps and took over management of the hotel. His son John would later describe him as the man who had inherited the energy, enthusiasm, and worth of his mother, as well as the steadfastness of his father. By now, the hotel had come a long way from the small farmhouse on that stormy night in 1865, but the Dodges were by no means finished with their building work. In 1921, President Harding not only paid a visit to the hotel, but also indulged in a game of golf on the course. A year later, in 1922, the West Wing had another extension, making it into the distinctive L shape that it is today. The dining room, now named the Crystal Ballroom, was also added. The story goes it was built in a circular shape so that no one, especially those guests aware of social standing, would be offended by having to sit at a corner table. Frank married Mary Bowden, originally a guest from Boston, in 1927. In 1928, the Dodges extended the East Wing, adding a 4th floor and a motorcar entrance. Though the railroads were still busy, cars were becoming commonplace. Guests could have their chauffeurs drop them off at this entrance. Whilst the guests checked in, bellboys carried their luggage to their rooms, while chauffeurs parked the car. Chauffeurs would stay the whole summer, residing in the building behind the hotel, now referred to as the chauffeur's dorm. They would take guests to various events and locations around the White Mountains, such as the Sunday afternoon polo matches at the Polo Ranch on the Hazen Farm. Whitefield Airport was built in 1928, and flights started ferrying both mail and passengers back and forth to Boston and New York. Tennis courts were added just across the road from the hotel, and guests would compete in tournaments. Sports tournaments were often held between not only guests of the hotel, but also guests from neighboring hotels and inns. In the evening, guests would often gather for a smoke, a drink, and a chat in the lounge where today's main dining room is located. By 1920, the lumber industry boom in Whitefield was over. Heavy foresting in the late 1800s had led to severe depletion of the forests, and companies such as Brown & Company had to look further from the mills for new land of forests and were eventually forced to close. Mills had competition from the West to supply industries such as paper pulping with timber. With the closure of the mills, the town's population shrunk, as many of the French Canadians left to find work in other parts of the country. During the 1920s, nearly all the mills that had lined the Johns River for decades disappeared. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed and the USA was thrown into the Great Depression. Whitefield's agriculture community suffered greatly, with only 450 cows left in the area and the Polo Ranch closed. Despite these hard times, a new high school was built. At Mountain View House, times were tough, and those in management nearly had to carry on without pay. Unlike many other businesses in the area, the hotel made it through the Depression. The golf course was given its professional design in 1938 by architect Ralph Barton. In the same year, a devastating hurricane swept through New England, the first in 69 years. New Hampshire escaped the storm's full force. However, wind speeds of 136 miles per hour were recorded on Mount Washington. After the storm had passed, Frank Dodge hired a lumber company to set up on the golf course and clear the fallen trees. He saved the timber, and the following year used it to build a sports clubhouse now referred to simply as the clubhouse. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the following day the United States entered World War II. The war caused a few changes around Mountain View House. With gasoline rationing in place, guests once again arrived by train. They were met at the station in Whitefield and transported by wagon to the hotel. With many local men away at war, the female staff not only performed their own jobs, but also doubled as caddies for guests using the golf course. In 1946, a swimming pool was added next door to the sports clubhouse. In 1948, Frank Dodge died of a heart attack. Frank's wife, Mary, took over the management of the hotel. Mary wrote her own cookery book entitled Cocktail Parties Made Easy. 6 years later, in 1954, her two sons, Skyler and John, assumed control of the business. Chapter 5. Skyler and John Dodge. Skyler and John Dodge became the fourth generation of the family to run the hotel. Skyler took control in 1954 and was joined by John when he returned from service in Korea. The two brothers and many of their staff would travel to Florida and work in hotels there during the winter season, returning each spring to prepare the hotel for reopening. The Dodgers kept careful track of where their employees were during the winter season and made sure to bring them back north for the summer. Staff would stay in separate male and female dormitories in the rear of the property. Mountain View House reportedly hosted a who's who of American celebrities, from Groucho Marx to Babe Ruth, Mark Twain, John D. Rockefeller, and Eleanor Roosevelt. An elderly guest once reminisced that as a teenager he had the honor of dancing with screen legend Bette Davis. Many presidents visited the hotel, including Warren G. Harding, the Roosevelts, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan. Dwight D. Eisenhower was especially fond of the hotel's reading room. So as not to disturb other guests with large amounts of security, Eisenhower would stay with the Dodges in their house just across the road from the hotel next to the swimming pool. The president would, however, sneak up to the reading room at night. In honor of these late-night escapades, the reading room has been renamed the Eisenhower Library. As transportation became faster, many husbands would stay in the city during the week and take the northbound train to Whitefield to stay with their families for summer weekends. Mountain View House became known for its Friday night dinner dances held to greet the returning husbands. Skyler Dodge had a gift for remembering who was who and greeted guests by name as they entered for dinner. A social hostess made sure that there was always plenty for the guests to do, such as adult and children ballroom dancing, taught by George and Betty Montgomery. Guests could play bridge and gin rummy and participate in popular casino nights. The cocktail lounge was located in today's main dining room, although cocktail parties were often held by the swimming pool. Young men served as house singers, and they would invite female guests to join them on the stage. Formal dress was expected, and men wore tuxedos or suits, whilst women wore long gowns or cocktail dresses. Saturday afternoon tea parties were held on the front lawn in the shade of the spreading sugar maples. The hotel had its own tennis and golf pros that taught guests how to handle a racket and a club. In 1965, To honor 100 years of continuous Dodge family ownership, the hotel built a new conference and social events building called Century Hall, now Presidential Hall. In 1969, the world watched Neil Armstrong take one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind when he became the first man to walk on the moon. He would later visit the Mountain View house, as did a young Maine author named Stephen King. As the years went by, the vacationing habits of Americans continued to change, and the clientele grew older. The days when guests would spend the whole summer season at the resort had disappeared. Skyler Dodge bought his brother's half of the business in 1967, and in 1979, he decided to sell the hotel. At the time of the sale, it was the oldest hotel in the country, owned and operated by the same family. The hotel was bought by Mountain View Associates, who soon sold the resort onward. The hotel passed through multiple owners, but after unprofitable seasons, closed its doors in 1986. Chapter 6. Sale, Auction, and Closure. In 1989, the hotel was put up for sale. The entire content of the hotel was auctioned off, including typewriters, iced tea glasses, bath towels, and pillowcases. At the end of 2 days, there were no acceptable bids for the hotel, and Mountain View House was boarded up. In 1990, Charles Carroll purchased Mountain View House in a foreclosure auction for $1 million. Carroll operated the golf course, but despite ideas such as converting it into a boys' boarding school, the hotel remained dormant for several more years. Chapter 7. Renovation and Reopening. Viewed from a distance, Mountain View House still looked every bit the architectural gem. Up close, the hotel was in a state of abandonment and disrepair. Many of the grand old ladies were destroyed by fire, but somehow Mountain View House managed to escape such a fate. In 1998, it found a new owner, Kevin Craffey, a contractor from Duxbury, Massachusetts, was searching the real estate ads for a vacation home when one advert caught his eye. It read, "Handyman Special. Wrap yourself in colonial revival architecture while enjoying spectacular mountain vistas." Situated on 360 acres of pristine wilderness, Grandam, New Hampshire Inn, featuring 200-plus bedrooms, conference facilities, 9-hole golf course, and more. Needs TLC. Price to sell at $1.3 million. Upon visiting, Craffey became enchanted by the hotel's potential and purchased the property in December 1998. The history of the resort intrigued him, and he began what would turn into a 4-year campaign to bring back the splendor of the golden days to Mountain View House. Craffey's first hurdle was to find funding for the project. Banks refused to provide loans to renovate what they considered an outdated destination resort. The New Hampshire Constitution forbid a tax waiver on the property whilst it was under reconstruction. However, Mr. Craffey was undeterred and paid a visit to state lawmakers in Concord. By the spring of 1999, he had won a constitutional amendment granting Mountain View House a tax waiver. The Department of Resources and Economic Development also awarded $1 million in combined loans and grants. In June 1999, the Mountain View Golf Course was reopened after renovations to the pool, sports clubhouse, and lawns. The key piece of funding came from the New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority in the form of $2 million of tax credits. Finally, the banks took an interest in the project. When the first meeting with a major bank had no results, the then governor of New Hampshire, Jean Shaheen, a strong supporter of the renovation from the start, stepped in and arranged for a bank summit. In March 2000, 3 of the state's banks provided the loans with one major condition. All the $2 million in tax credits had to be sold. With the deadline only 4 weeks away, none of the credits had been sold. Whitefield locals stepped in to buy what tax credits they could. Within 2 weeks, Mr. Craffey had managed to sell $300,000 in credits, But with $1.7 million left to sell, the hotel's future wasn't looking good. Mr. Craffey returned to Massachusetts to tell his family the news that the fight to save the hotel had been lost. His news was met with an unexpected response. His 5-year-old daughter, Felicia Rose, walked up to her father, punched him in the stomach, and pronounced, "Daddy, that's my castle, and you said winners don't quit." The mantra remained with him, and a few days later on a flight to L.A., Mr. Craffey found himself getting out of his seat, standing in the aisle, and telling other passengers about the hotel. He enlisted 5 passengers for advice, consisting of a national sales representative, a website designer, a housewife, and an accountant and a secretary. Before the flight touched down, they took a vote that Mr. Craffey promised to honor the outcome of. Only hours after arriving in L.A., Mr. Craffey found himself flying back to Whitefield Airport. The vote had passed in favor of returning to the hotel 3-2. However, he still had to sell the tax credits. In a final hour effort, Craffey called National Gypsum Drywall, and as fate would have it, the sales manager, named Mo Dykard, picked up the phone. He was not only impressed with Craffey's plans, but he knew the hotel. In years past, he had been the golf pro at a local Bethlehem golf course and had played the course at Mountain View House, setting the course record. Within days, National Gypsum bought up the remaining tax credits. The first person Craffey called to tell the good news to was his daughter. In May 2002, after the completion of a $20 million restoration, the Mountain View House proudly reopened as Mountain View Grand Resort and Spa. In the course of the renovation, 937 windows were removed and 5,622 panes of glass were reglazed, sanded, and painted. 7 layers of wallpaper were stripped away, totaling 2,520,000 square feet, the equivalent of 62 football fields, and 78 miles of the 135-year-old exterior cedar siding was restored and repainted to the original colonial yellow. As the end of the renovation drew near, the governor of New Hampshire, Jean Shaheen, paid a visit to the hotel. The original rooms had been converted into 145 guest rooms and suites, and the signature tower became home to a spa. Chapter 8, Now and the Future. In 2005, the current owner, American Financial Group, purchased the hotel and continued to renovate the property and enhance guests' amenities and experience. Mountain View Grand is one of only 4 grand hotels in New Hampshire. It is set in 1,700 acres with 145 rooms and suites. The resort is home to an award-winning tower spa, a historic golf course, a magnificent slate-lined wine cellar, complete with chef's table dining and a 17-seat movie theater. A mobile app provides guests with a variety of information, including an activity schedule and information on the local area. A proud member of the Historic Hotels of America, the Mountain View Grand has begun its journey to recapture some of the agricultural history of the property, reclaiming vintage pasture lands with the help of Scottish Highland cattle, and refurbishing the old red barn, turning it into a working fiber farm. With help from historic photos taken in the early 20th century, the hotel's greenhouse and vegetable gardens are being revitalized and once again used to supplement the chef's kitchen with fresh herbs, salad greens, greenhouse tomatoes and peppers, and even corn and pumpkins. A cut flower garden surrounds the area, providing cuttings for the hotel's many flower arrangements, as well as bees aplenty, which pollinate the nearby blueberry bushes and apple orchard. Just off the golf course stands the 121-foot wind turbine that supplies parts of the hotel's electricity. The rest of the resort's electrical needs are met by using renewable energy credits. Visiting the Mountain View Grand today carries you along the same historic route from Boston to Montreal traveled by those first surprise guests in 1865, over 150 years ago. Look closely as you journey through the White Mountain Wilderness for memories of the historic past, the mighty logging rivers of New Hampshire, a New England country farmhouse, the Whitefield Bandstand, The mills may have passed into memory, but the area is thriving once again, with tourism supplying year-round employment. From the recently restored front veranda, marvel at the resolute mountain peaks above the vista of maple, pine, and birch forest, even fuller and healthier than those lumbered a century ago. Whether sipping cocoa from grateful hands on a November morning or under a star-drenched February night sky, embrace the White Mountains in all their seasons, something 1920s tourists could only have dreamed of. Couple the timelessness of tuxedos and cocktail dresses with 21st century amenities as you enjoy yourself in the hotel's original crystal ballroom or tower spa. Rediscovering histories provides fertility to the memories we make today. It is our hope that as you discover northern New Hampshire hospitality, craftsmanship, wilderness, and character, you do so while exploring the history that makes them so cherished.